Have you ever had an idea that you tried to implement before its time? What were the consequences of jumping to action before the idea had been fully considered? In some cases, it means bankruptcy. Let's examine the dot-com bubble, which roughly lasted from 1997 to about 2000. During this time, there was unbridled optimism about the internet business. Any business, it seemed, with a dot-com drew investors. In Super Bowl 34, in the year 2000, there were 17 dot-com advertisements. Each 30-second spot cost $2 million. A year later, Super Bowl 35, there were only 3 dot-com commercials. The bubble had burst. There are some pros and cons to this bubble. The upside, the exuberance helped usher in a new economy. The downside, it led to many spectacular failures. And I think it provides a lesson in the importance of fully vetting an idea. Let's look at 2 examples. Third Voice. It was founded in the late 1990s. Here was the business idea. Users of Third Voice could plant virtual sticky notes on websites that they visited. Other users could then see these comments. Their goal was to promote free speech on the internet. But here's what happened. The sticky notes quickly degenerated into sarcastic, cynical, and lewd comments. The result? Third Voice gained enemies faster than users. In 2001, they were shut down. Let's look at another example. IM.com. IM.com was designed to link actors and models directly to casting directors. The goal was to cut out the middleman, that is, the talent agent. How? Models and actors posted their portfolios online so that casting directors could view and spot talent themselves. They received $48 million in financing. Here's the problem. It turns out that casting directors like talent agents. You see, talent agents act as a screen. They save time for the casting directors. This out-of-business.com employed over 60 people at one time. Let's look at where we are in the creative problem-solving process. It's not enough to have a good idea. What really makes great creators stand out is their ability to polish and refine their ideas into gems. Now, in a way, this comes natural for those who have a developer preference. With tools, we can make this even more efficient. We can make this kind of thinking easier, even for those who may not have the developer preference. So what happens in the develop step of this creative process? We're looking at an ability to evaluate and transform a broad idea into a specific workable solution, one that resolves the challenge that we intended to address. Let me tell you a story. Do you know about the origins of the Egg McMuffin? Herb Peterson was a franchise owner of several McDonald's out in California. Now, it turns out Herb Peterson really liked Eggs Benedict. Now, you may not know this, but at the time, McDonald's, from its inception until in the 1970s, only served lunches and dinners. Now, remember, Herb Peterson really liked Eggs Benedict, and he felt that perhaps he could better utilize his store operations if he began to offer breakfast. And so he tinkered with this idea of an Egg Benedict and turning it into a sandwich, which eventually led to the Egg McMuffin. And he began to sell these in the morning time. Now, when McDonald's, the corporation, had heard about this, he was scolded and, in fact, reprimanded for doing this. Later on, Ray Kroc came out to visit Herb Peterson, and Herb insisted that Ray Kroc try this sandwich. If you look at Ray Kroc's biography, you can see his reaction. At first, he said, "It was a crazy idea. That is, until I took a bite. and then he could see the potential. 3 years later, it took 3 years. 3 years later, McDonald's was serving Egg McMuffins across the entire US. And today, 30% of McDonald's revenue comes from breakfast, and was all started by this one sandwich. Evaluative thinking isn't simply rejecting the bad ideas. Remember, in ideate, we're generating novelty, kind of like the Egg McMuffin, a very novel idea. In develop, we explore the value of that novelty, trying to retain it into something that's workable. Since we are exploring novelty in develop, the develop step of the process has more of a convergent feel to it, or a convergent orientation. Let me remind you of the principles of convergent thinking. The principle that's key to convergent thinking, much like suspend judgment is for divergent thinking, is to use affirmative judgment. When converging, we apply affirmative judgment. The first thing we see should be something that's positive. We go positive first. The second principle is to keep novelty alive. Stay open to original thinking and unexpected outcomes. After all, you have decided to use creative thinking. Don't just reject an idea simply because it doesn't fit the old or existing paradigm. The next guideline is to check your objectives. The previous guideline focuses on novelty and that side of the creativity equation. But remember, we have to balance novelty off with usefulness, appropriateness, and value. We evaluate and screen our ideas against our success criteria to get at the most promising solution. And then our fourth principle for convergent thinking is to stay focused, which is a willingness to work with the idea, to embrace its imperfections, and to refine the idea over time. We recognize that sometimes it takes hard work to make something that you've fallen in love with really work. The principles are important for both developing our ideas and when reacting to others' ideas. When I do creativity training programs, I like to ask participants a question. Imagine you've come up with an idea and you've proposed that idea to someone, and you want them to give you feedback. You want them to react to your idea. How would you like them to react? Describe to me the best case example of good feedback. Here are some of the typical responses that I get. People ask for constructive feedback. Help me to improve my thinking. Give me a balanced approach, both the positives and the negatives. Be honest with me, but not harsh. Ask questions. Now, here's a tool that sort of takes this advice and puts it into action. It operates the very advice that people give me when I ask them how they would like to receive feedback. The name of this tool is POINT. POINT is an acronym. P stands for pluses. And it's important that we follow this acronym in the order suggested. So when evaluating an idea and looking to develop an idea, the first thing we do is we look for the strengths, the good points, the positives. We suggest that you should come up with at least 3. Then we move on to the O in POINT, which stands for opportunities. Often when we evaluate an idea, we only look at what it delivers here and today. We don't think about the future scenarios and future possibilities. So opportunities gets us to think like futurists. If we pursued this solution, if we pursued this change, what might happen? What would be future potentials? What would be some spin-offs? What would be some possibilities? To help us to think about opportunities, we use the invitational stem, it might. If we implemented this idea, if we implemented this solution, or we implemented this change, it might. And then we fill in the blank. Now, we can't be naive and ignore any possible shortcomings or limitations. So the I in POINT has us look at the issues. These are the concerns, the drawbacks, the shortcomings of the idea. And we phrase these in language that we used earlier. to invite a problem-solving form of thinking, we phrase these challenges, we phrase these in the form of a challenge. So the issue begins with how to, how might, what might. When we phrase these as questions, they invoke a response. When someone asks us a question, what's our natural reaction? We look to answer the question. So it's important that you phrase the issues in the form of the how to or how might. This sets us up for the next element within the point tool, NT. NT stands for new thinking. And we use new thinking now to address our issues. We begin by prioritizing them. We start with the biggest issue first, and we generate ideas to overcome that issue. And then we go on to the next biggest issue, and so forth, generating ideas, engaging in divergent thinking with the hope of coming up with ideas that will address the how-to, the how might, that will overcome that challenge that we identified during the issue phase of this tool. You then evaluate your analysis, what you've generated through the point, and you make a decision. Gosh, it's perfect. Nothing is really fundamentally wrong with it. Let's keep it as it is. Now you're ready to move on to the next step of the CPS process. But you might decide that there are some ideas that you generated when you were applying new thinking. And this might suggest ways to refine the idea, to develop it into an even stronger solution. Or on balance, after doing this evaluation, you might decide to kill it, not to go forward with it. But at least you've given it a fair shot, a fair analysis. Let's practice this tool. I'm going to walk you through an example. Here's an example of an idea. I share this with audiences when I work with them. It's a novel design for a wheelbarrow. And in this design, rather than the wheels being on the front of the wheelbarrow, or the wheel being on the front, this wheelbarrow has two wheels and they're in the back. It has a fairly large hopper. It has two handles that are connected by a bar. And it has two pegs in the front of the wheelbarrow. Now, when I share this with most audiences and I ask them to give me comments, their initial reaction is, it's crazy, it's backwards, it won't ever work. Those pegs in the front will dig in. It'll be hard to dump the material out. Now, if that's how I'm evaluated, if I receive that kind of evaluation, that kind of criticism, it's likely that I wouldn't go forward with the idea. But let's see what happens when we apply point to this unusual wheelbarrow. So in the first step, we look at pluses. And we might say, in considering this wheelbarrow, that the hopper has a lot of space. The handle seems reinforced because it's connected. The wheelbarrow won't tip over. The wheels give it more stability, and it might be easier to dump material. Now, we move to the O in the point tool. We go to opportunities. Remember, opportunities start with it might. It might make gardening easier. It might reduce the number of accidents. It might replace the traditional wheelbarrow. It might cost less to produce. It might be easier to store. Now notice, these are possibilities. We're not sure they're advantages. They're things that might happen if we pursued this idea. Now we go to issues. We engage in effective critical thinking at this point. But remember, we phrase the issues in the form of a challenge statement. So our issues that we identify might look like the following. How to make the wheelbarrow easier to maneuver. How to make it more attractive. What might be ways to make the grip more comfortable? How to improve the traction. How to identify buyers. How to strengthen the center of gravity. Now, when people first begin applying point, a common mistake I see is that they don't phrase the issues in a question. They simply list the issue as if it were an obstacle. And when it's identified as an obstacle, it doesn't compel us to think about ways to get over that issue. So again, it's important that it's phrased in the form of a question, because this sets us up for the next step in this tool, the new thinking, which we use to overcome our issues, again, beginning with the biggest issue first. So imagine we've looked over the issues and we've ranked them and we've decided that the biggest issue is how to make the wheelbarrow easier to maneuver. Now remember, at this point, we're flipping into divergent thinking because we want to mount as many ideas as possible against this issue. So we might say things like, make the handle longer, push down on the wheelbarrow instead of lifting up, attach and extend braces on the sides of the barrow, attach Segway technology to it, make it heavier near the handles. And we would continue piling ideas on the issue with the goal of coming up with at least some ways in which we could overcome this issue, or at least to give it a fair chance. Now, a common mistake I see here is that groups or individuals, instead of selecting one issue to address, after they've gone through identifying the issues and they move to the new thinking, they'll start just generating ideas without really targeting one by one the issues. They sort of take a shotgun approach. This isn't as effective as it is to move sequentially, beginning with the biggest issue and moving in order. Now, this wheelbarrow that I shared with you, the one that I've described, actually does exist. It's called the load dumper. And it does have pluses. It is easier to haul heavy loads, and it has a tighter turning radius because you push down on it instead of lifting up. And it has better balance. Let's take an idea that's pretty novel, something that doesn't exist. When I do point with teams in training, to help demonstrate the value of point, and especially drive home that concept of staying open to novelty, I'll have them practice point on an idea that's pretty outside the box. Now, here's an idea. I'm going to pace you through this, and I'd like you to think through the point tool with me. So try it out. Here's the idea. Imagine schools had no teachers. No teachers. The only adults in the building with the students are project managers, not teachers. What might be 3 pluses of this idea? What might be 3 opportunities? What might be 3 issues? So, if schools had no teachers, if there were only project managers, can you think of 3 strengths to this idea? 3 advantages that this might pose? How about opportunities? If schools had no teachers, what might happen? Can you think of 3 it mights, 3 spin-offs, 3 potentials? And then we have to apply good critical thinking. Let's identify some issues. What concerns might you have? What might be some shortcomings with this idea? And again, we phrase them in a challenge statement form. How to, how might, what might. Can you think of and can you phrase these issues in the form of a challenge statement? And then finally, in the next step of this tool, NT, new thinking. Can you think of one big issue that might really get in the way of this idea being effective? Think of that in your mind or capture it in a computer or on a piece of paper. And then generate ideas. What new thoughts do you have that will help you to address this issue? You can pause the lecture if you need to. Now we evaluate the proposed idea. Once we've generated these pluses and opportunities, we step back and we look to see if we can refine the idea or if it's good as it is. Probably this highly novel idea in terms of eliminating teachers and having project managers would require some refinement. Or again, on balance, we step back and we analyze what we've generated. We might decide not to go forward. Often what people say to me is that one of the benefits of point is that it takes an idea that's really novel and it can transform it into something that actually is workable. Here are some uses for point. This is a tool that is incredibly flexible and can be used in lots of ways. And it doesn't have to be used in a formal way. It can be used in an informal discussion. For example, many years ago when I first began teaching, I was working with at-risk students, freshmen, who were in the Educational Opportunity Program. And I had one young man come to me, and he was kind of bashful, and he came up to me with his head down, and he wanted to talk to me about his major paper in the course. And he had an idea he wanted to share with me. You see, each student had to write a paper on a subject of their own choosing, but they had to relate it to the study of creativity. And this young man came up to me kind of sheepishly, and he said, "Dr. P, can I talk to you about my paper?" "Sure." "Well, I'd like to do my paper on woodworking." And so my first reaction was, "Well, you know what I like about your idea? I happen to know from things that you've shared in class that this is a hobby of yours, that you're very interested in woodworking." And he kind of lifted his head up and he started to stand straight. "Well, yeah, that's right, Dr. P. Well, and I think that's wonderful, and I do have some concerns. One issue might be I'm not very familiar with this area, and I'm not sure there's a lot of literature out there. So how might you be sure that you can connect this to creativity and the study of creativity?" So what did I do? I went from a plus into an issue. I was using a shortened version of point, and it was interesting. As soon as I phrased my issue in the form of a question, he immediately began to answer it. He said, "Well, you know, Dr. P, I'm pretty sure that the technology department has a furniture making unit. Maybe I can go speak to some of the professors there and they can help me out." You see, he started to think of ways around the issue that I presented him. By the time our conversation was over with, he had some specific ideas he could follow up on in order to make sure that he was in the best place to write that paper. As a team, you can use point when you're reviewing a proposed idea. You can go through point together with each person moving through the tool, starting with the pluses, looking at the opportunities, the issues, working together to overcome the issues with new thinking. Even school-age children can use point. I remember one of the graduates of our program, who was a middle school teacher, working with fifth graders on the New York State geography assignment, had students working in groups, creating a brochure for a different region of the state as assigned by her. The students created these draft brochures, and then they had to go to another group and present their draft brochure to that group. And the other group had to provide that group with feedback using point. And then before they could submit their final assignment, the final brochure, they had to go through the feedback that they received and had to demonstrate how they responded to that feedback. Point is also a wonderful tool for capturing lessons learned from a project. We run a conference every year, an annual conference, and the conference committee, as soon as the conference is over, gets together and does an analysis, a debrief meeting using point to evaluate how the conference went. What worked well? What are some opportunities for the future? What were some of the issues that we need to address? And while it's still fresh in our minds, what new thinking can we come up with? When we do performance reviews in our department and a faculty member is coming up for promotion, as part of the review process, the faculty member receives feedback using the point tool. It can be used to develop a product concept. So you have a product concept that you're toying with and you're thinking about launching it into the marketplace. Before launching it, you can use point to develop that idea. Before you present an idea to a group, you can do point on the idea. And then as you're doing the presentation, you can use point as the framework to underscore the pluses, the opportunities if the idea was pursued, some issues and how some of those issues, through your anticipation, could be addressed. And finally, another example. Point can be used to enhance team effectiveness. Michael West, a business school professor who's tracked teams over time, has observed that those teams that are able to sustain their innovation have a quality that he calls reflexivity. That is, that teams stop occasionally and evaluate their performance. What a wonderful tool, what a balanced, affirmative tool to use that will help to develop a team's effectiveness. You can use point to encourage that kind of reflexivity. So let's talk about point and some of the benefits. Well, it fits the way in which people wish to receive feedback. It's easy to use, even a fifth grader can use it. It clearly targets us towards development. It gives us, in fact, actions that we can take to enhance the original concept. Yet it also begins to point towards gaining acceptance and buy-in, because as we start to think about the issues, they often relate to other groups and people and how they'll respond. And in this way, we not only improve the idea, but we're improving it in such a way that it'll be easier to sell and move it towards action. We recently conducted a research study where we looked at the transfer of training after taking managers through creative problem solving. And we found that one of the tools most often used after training was point. Now, one of the benefits is that when we use point to give feedback, we move from what's referred to as controlling feedback, which is more directive, where we point to issues as if they were fixed external demands and requirements. And we move more towards what's referred to as informational feedback. That's providing ways for people to learn and to develop. So let's look at taking point forward. I'd like you to try it out. Before the next lecture, let's try 2 applications. And let's try 2 very different applications. Let's try one that's more formal. Let's take point and evaluate an idea that you've generated. Maybe it's an idea that you generated previously for one of the challenges that you've selected as we've gone through this course. Work through it in a very deliberate fashion, completely, from beginning to end. And in the examples that I provided, I limited the number of elements, the number of pluses and opportunities. Don't limit yourself because of those examples. And I mentioned earlier, at least 3 in each category, but that's a minimum. Go until you run out of thoughts in terms of what the pluses are, what the opportunities are, what the issues are. And then, especially with the new thinking, it's important to engage in divergent thinking. Otherwise, we may overlook or not get to an idea that will really address the issue that's been identified. And then try it out informally. It's a powerful tool to guide a conversation. Someone comes to you and shares an idea, maybe a coworker or someone in your family, maybe even your child. Maybe your child comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm interested in painting my room." And at first you're a little nervous about that. Try responding to that person, identifying the pluses first, then the opportunities. Then think about the issues and phrase them in the form of a question. How to, how might. And I bet you'll see a very different response from that person because you're giving them feedback in the way that most of us want feedback.